Imagine this. You walk into a room, a dinner party, a boardroom, a first date, and within 60 seconds, someone has already decided who you are. Not based on what you've said, not based on your credentials, your reputation, or the carefully constructed version of yourself you've spent years perfecting. They've read you completely. Before you opened your mouth, before you shook a single hand, before you smiled your most rehearsed, most confident smile, they already knew. And the terrifying part? You had no idea it was happening. They noticed the way your voice shifted when you felt uncertain, the way you laughed just a fraction too loudly when the room made you feel invisible, the way you rushed to fill silences, not because you had something to say, but because being truly still in front of others made you feel dangerously exposed. Someone in that room was reading you, not with words, not with interrogation, but with the oldest and most lethal instrument ever wielded between human beings: attention. They saw the parts of you that you have spent years learning to manage, hide, and quietly deny. And you didn't notice, because no one ever tells you that being seen isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it's subtle, it's slow, it's surgical. The best readers never announce what they know, they simply never forget it. Now, flip it. Think about the last time you trusted someone you shouldn't have, the colleague who seemed warm but systematically dismantled your reputation behind closed doors, the partner who performed vulnerability so convincingly that you mistook their need for control as emotional depth, the friend who always showed up but only when they needed an audience for their own suffering. You didn't see it. Not at first, maybe not for months, maybe not for years. And when the mask finally slipped, the question that kept you awake at 3 in the morning wasn't, "Why did they do this to me?" It was, "How did I not see it sooner?" If that question has ever haunted you, if you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling like something was deeply off but couldn't name it, then what you're about to discover will permanently change the way you see every person in your life. Before we go deeper, do one thing right now. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel exists for the people who refuse to sleepwalk through human nature, the ones who want to see clearly, think sharply, and never be blindsided again. Now, let's go. This is the question Friedrich Nietzsche spent his entire life trying to answer, not politely, not gently, not with the reassuring softness of modern self-help. Nietzsche tore into human nature like a surgeon who had long since abandoned the comfort of anesthesia. He looked at the way people present themselves to the world and saw something most philosophers were too afraid to name directly: that the performance is the person, that the mask worn long enough fuses to the face, that what people call their true self is often nothing more than the lie they have rehearsed so many times it began to feel like memory. And Nietzsche warned us, clearly, coldly, without mercy, that we do not speak from truth, we speak from protection. Language, he argued, was never built to reveal who we are. It was built to survive, to hide, to belong. So when someone speaks to you, when they charm you, convince you, confide in you, understand this: you are not hearing their soul. You are hearing their mask explain why it deserves to be accepted. And here is the paradox that should stop you cold. The people who are most convinced they can read others with precision are often the least equipped to do so, because confidence in perception is not the same as accuracy of perception. What we believe is intuition is frequently nothing more than projection, filling in the gaps of who someone is with fragments of who we are. We don't see people, we see mirrors, and we call it understanding. So what separates the rare individual, the one who reads people with almost unsettling clarity, from the rest? Is it intelligence? Is it life experience? Is it emotional sensitivity? Or is it something darker, something far less flattering to admit? A willingness to see human beings not as we wish they were, but as they actually are, stripped of every social grace, every cultural performance, every carefully curated self-presentation. Nietzsche believed most people choose comfortable illusion, not because they are stupid, but because truth, when applied to human nature, is a weight most people quietly decide not to carry. It is easier to call manipulation passion. It is easier to call fear caution. It is easier to call resentment principle. But truth leaks. Always. It leaks in pauses, in deflections, in the tone beneath the tone. And once you learn to hear it, this exploration of Nietzsche's 18 darkest truths about human nature will show you exactly how. You will never unhear it again. The question isn't whether you are ready to read people. The question is whether you are ready to discover that they have already been reading you.
Every person you have ever met is running a script they did not write. That is not a metaphor. It is not poetic license. It is the single most important psychological truth you will ever encounter, and the one most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. Because the moment you accept it fully, the moment it moves from intellectual concept to lived reality, the world cracks open in a way it never quite closes again. Nietzsche saw it with devastating clarity. He called it the herd mentality, not as an insult, but as a diagnosis. He watched human beings construct elaborate identities built almost entirely from borrowed beliefs, inherited fears, and the desperate unspoken need to be accepted by the group. And he understood something that most of us resist with every ounce of our psychological energy, that the person sitting across from you, confident, articulate, certain of themselves, is in all likelihood performing a version of themselves they constructed in childhood to survive an environment that punished authenticity. The transcript makes this devastatingly plain. From the earliest age, we learn the rules of the performance. Cry too loud, you are too sensitive. Question too much, you are too difficult. Shine too bright, you are too much. And so we adjust, we shrink, we reshape ourselves into something the world around us signals it can tolerate. We call this process growing up. Nietzsche called it the death of the self before the self ever had the chance to live. Carl Jung named what gets buried in this process the shadow, the repository of every impulse, desire, truth, and authentic response we were taught was unacceptable. The anger we swallowed, the ambition we apologized for, the grief we performed our way around because the people in our lives needed us to be functional more than they needed us to be real. Jung believed, and decades of clinical psychology have since confirmed, that what we exile into the shadow does not disappear. It goes underground. It shapes behavior from beneath the surface, like tectonic plates shifting in silence until the earthquake makes itself impossible to ignore. This is precisely what Nietzsche meant when he wrote that every profound spirit needs a mask, not because depth is dishonest, but because depth is dangerous. In a world built on surface signals and social contracts, genuine authenticity is not just uncomfortable, it is threatening. To others, certainly, but more profoundly to the person themselves. Because if the mask comes off, if the performance drops, what stands beneath it must be faced. And for most people, that confrontation has been postponed for so long that the very idea of it produces something closer to existential terror than simple discomfort. Arthur Schopenhauer, whose work carved the philosophical bedrock upon which Nietzsche would later build, argued that human beings are not primarily rational creatures who occasionally act on emotion. We are creatures of will and drive, of blind, surging psychological forces, who then deploy rationality like a defense attorney, not to find truth, but to justify what the will has already decided. We do not reason our way to our beliefs. We believe first and reason afterward, constructing elaborate intellectual structures to make the unconscious look deliberate. This is why the transcript draws such a precise and unsettling distinction. People are not hiding from you, they are hiding from themselves. The man who cannot stop talking about his own strength has not deceived you. He has deceived himself first, and so thoroughly that the performance has fused with his self-concept. The woman who preaches endlessly about healing has not chosen inauthenticity. She has simply learned that performing the idea of healing is psychologically safer than submitting to the actual, unglamorous, non-linear process of it. Viktor Frankl, writing from the ruins of everything Nietzsche had warned would eventually collapse, observed that the greatest human suffering is not pain, it is meaninglessness. And the most common response to meaninglessness is not philosophical inquiry, it is performance. We perform purpose when we have lost it. We perform certainty when we are drowning in doubt. We perform connection when we are profoundly, achingly alone, because the performance, however hollow, at least provides the temporary analgesic of being seen, even if what is being seen is not real. And here is where it becomes truly dangerous. Because when someone has been performing long enough, when the mask has been worn through enough seasons, enough relationships, enough versions of the same argument and the same apology and the same quiet compromise, the performance stops feeling like a performance. It begins to feel like identity. The mask becomes the face, the role becomes the self. And the tragedy, the one Nietzsche returned to again and again with the urgency of a man who could see the wreckage before it arrived, is this. A person who has lost the distinction between their mask and their self cannot be read the way a conscious performer can be. They are not strategically hiding truth, they are genuinely unaware of it, which means the truth must be found somewhere else entirely. Not in what they say, not even always in what they do, but in the gaps, in the contradictions, the deflections, the micro-hesitations, the topics they approach and then abandon like a hand pulled back from a flame. It lives in the silence that follows certain questions, in the brightness that appears too quickly in their eyes when someone finally sees them, and the way that brightness is immediately covered, managed, suppressed. Because they have learned, as we all have learned, that to be seen is to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to be at risk. But here is what neither the mask nor its wearer can ultimately prevent. Truth does not wait for permission. It leaks. And what comes next, the consequences of that leaking, the ways it silently reshapes every relationship, every dynamic, every quiet room you have ever sat in wondering why something felt off, is far more unsettling than most people are prepared for.
There is a cost to not seeing clearly, and it is not paid all at once. That is what makes it so devastating. It does not arrive like a collision, sudden, undeniable, impossible to ignore. It arrives the way water damage arrives, slowly, silently, invisibly, until one day the structure that looked perfectly solid from the outside simply gives way, and you are left standing in the wreckage of a relationship, a career, a version of yourself, wondering how you missed every single warning sign that, in retrospect, was never hidden at all. The transcript captures this with surgical precision. It describes the moment when someone's mask finally slips, not dramatically, not in the way films would have you believe, but in the smallest, most mundane of instants. The jaw that clenches while the mouth says, "I'm fine." The shoulders that stay rigid even when the voice performs relaxation. The laugh that arrives a half-second too late, slightly too loud, slightly too bright, like a light fixture flickering before it burns out entirely. These are not accidents. These are not quirks. These are confessions, spoken in the only language the buried self knows how to use when the conscious mind is too committed to its own performance to allow the truth direct passage. And the consequence of not learning to read that language is this: you spend your life responding to the character rather than the person. You fall in love with a performance. You build loyalty toward a curated identity. You fear the disapproval of someone who is themselves disappearing beneath layers of managed self-presentation. You take personally the coldness of someone who is not cold toward you, they are cold toward themselves, and you simply happened to be standing close enough to feel the temperature. Cognitive science has a name for what makes this so persistently difficult to escape. It is called confirmation bias, the neurological tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in ways that confirm what we already believe. Once we have formed an impression of someone, the brain works with remarkable efficiency to protect that impression from contradictory evidence. The red flags get rationalized, the inconsistencies get explained away, the moments of mask slippage get attributed to stress, to a bad day, to circumstances, anything except the possibility that what we briefly glimpsed was the truth and everything else was the performance. Daniel Kahneman's decades of research into human cognition revealed what Nietzsche understood philosophically long before the neuroscience existed to confirm it. We are not rational beings who occasionally make emotional errors. We are emotional beings who occasionally manage to be rational, and even then only with enormous effort, only against the powerful current of unconscious pattern recognition that governs the vast majority of our perceptions and decisions. We see what we are prepared to see. We hear what we have already decided to hear. And the gap between what someone is showing us and what we are actually receiving is where manipulation, heartbreak, and quiet, accumulating devastation find their most comfortable home. The transcript draws our attention to something even more unsettling than being misled by others. It points to the consequences of the internal failure of sight, the ways in which we misread ourselves with the same confident inaccuracy we apply to everyone around us. The man who genuinely believes he is confident when he is performing confidence so habitually that the performance has become indistinguishable from experience. The woman who genuinely believes she has healed because she has become extraordinarily skilled at narrating healing without submitting to it. The person who mistakes their coping mechanism for their personality, their armor for their identity, and then builds an entire life around defending a self that was never real to begin with. Jean-Paul Sartre called this bad faith, the act of deceiving oneself about one's own freedom and nature. Not lying to others, but lying to oneself so completely, so structurally, that the lie becomes the architecture of consciousness. And the consequence of living in bad faith, Sartre argued, Nietzsche demonstrated, and the transcript confirms, is not simply inauthenticity. It is a quiet, corrosive suffering that the person cannot name because they cannot locate its source. They feel vaguely dissatisfied without knowing why. They feel unseen without acknowledging that they have made themselves deliberately opaque. They feel lonely in the center of full rooms because every connection they make is a connection to the mask, and somewhere beneath the performance, the real self knows it and grieves it without ever being given the language to say so. This is the unseen consequence that shapes entire civilizations, not just individual lives. When enough people are running this pattern simultaneously, when enough human beings are performing identities they did not consciously choose, responding to each other's performances with performances of their own, you do not get a society of authentic connection. You get what Nietzsche called the herd, a collective of people who have mistaken their conditioning for their character, their fears for their values, their survival mechanisms for their souls. A world in which the loudest voices belong not to the wisest minds, but to the most defended ones, where power accrues not to those with the most truth, but to those with the most convincing performance of certainty. And perhaps most quietly devastating of all, you get people who have forgotten that there was ever anything beneath the mask worth finding. The transcript speaks to this in a way that is almost unbearable in its accuracy. It describes the person who posts endlessly about healing because the performance of healing is safer than the actual experience of it. The person who jokes relentlessly because silence would force an encounter with something unresolved and unforgiving. the person who talks constantly about strength because the terror of being perceived as weak is so foundational, so deeply wired into their sense of survival that strength has stopped being something they have and become something they must continuously prove. To others, yes, but most exhaustingly to themselves. These are not character flaws. They are the entirely predictable, entirely human consequences of a world that taught people consistently from the earliest age, through 1,000 small lessons and 1,000 quiet corrections, that the truest parts of themselves were the parts least safe to show. But here is what the truth, in its relentless way, refuses to allow. The performance always has a ceiling. The mask always develops fractures. The cost of maintaining the distance between who you perform yourself to be and who you actually are compounds, silently, invisibly, with the patient indifference of interest accumulating on a debt you have been pretending doesn't exist. And at some point, in some conversation, in some moment of unexpected stillness, in some 3 a.m. encounter with your own reflection, the gap becomes impossible to sustain. That is the moment everything either breaks or finally, after all this time, begins.
There is a moment, and if you have lived long enough, if you have been honest enough with yourself in the dark, quiet hours that follow a life half-lived, you will recognize it. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself with the dramatic clarity of a cinematic revelation. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary conversation, an unremarkable Tuesday, a silence that somehow stretches 1 second longer than comfort allows. And in that second, something shifts. You stop reacting. You start seeing. Not seeing in the surface-level, socially conditioned way you have been trained to see since childhood, where you accept the performance at face value because accepting it is easier, safer, and infinitely less disruptive than acknowledging the fractures beneath it, but seeing in the way Nietzsche meant when he spoke of the Übermensch, not the cartoonish, misappropriated version that history has weaponized, but the genuine philosophical vision. A human being who has looked directly at the uncomfortable architecture of reality, refused the comfort of inherited illusion, and chosen, deliberately and at great personal cost, to build their perception on truth rather than on the consensus of the comfortable. This is the rebellion, and it begins not with a declaration, but with a decision to stop pretending you haven't already seen what you've seen. The transcript is luminous on this point. It describes with quiet devastation the moment when the patterns finally become undeniable, when the person who always deflects does it one time too many, when the confidence that always seemed slightly too loud finally reveals the frequency of its fear, when the kindness that never quite reached the eyes becomes impossible to mistake for warmth. And it tells us something radical. That in that moment, the correct response is not anger, not withdrawal, not the protective hardening that most people mistake for wisdom. The correct response is clarity without cruelty. This is the counterintuitive revolution at the heart of Nietzsche's darkest truths. Most people, when they begin to see through the performances of those around them, make one of 2 errors. The first is naivety. They see the crack in the mask, feel momentarily unsettled, and then consciously choose to look away because the alternative requires a renegotiation of everything they have built on the foundation of that person's performed identity. The second error is cynicism. They see through the performance, feel the cold satisfaction of having been right all along, and retreat into a superior detachment that mistakes emotional distance for psychological freedom. Nietzsche rejected both with equal contempt. Naivety, he argued, is not innocence, it is cowardice dressed in the language of optimism. And cynicism is not wisdom, it is disappointment that has given up on transformation and decided to call it surrender, sophistication. The genuine rebellion, the one that actually changes the internal architecture of how you move through the world, is something far more demanding than either. It is the willingness to see people completely, mask and all, wound and all, contradiction and all, without losing yourself in either their performance or your reaction to it. It is what the transcript calls the moment when empathy becomes inevitable. Not the performative kind, not the kind that performs understanding to win approval, but the kind born from genuine grief at the weight of what it costs to be human. Viktor Frankl discovered this inside the most unimaginable circumstances human beings have ever been forced to endure. Stripped of everything, identity, family, future, the most basic dignities of existence, he found that the one freedom that could never be taken was the space between stimulus and response, the capacity to choose how one perceives, how one interprets, how one assigns meaning to what is happening. And he emerged from that experience with a truth so simple it should not be as rare as it is, that the person who understands why someone behaves as they do is no longer at the mercy of that behavior. Understanding is not the same as accepting. Seeing clearly is not the same as surrendering your boundaries. This is the distinction that most conversations about empathy catastrophically fail to make, and it is the distinction that separates those who are transformed by Nietzsche's insights from those who are merely intellectually entertained by them. When you genuinely understand that the colleague who undermines you is operating from a terror of inadequacy so deep that it has become their entire relational strategy, you do not suddenly welcome the undermining. You stop internalizing it. When you see that the person who withholds affection is not withholding it from you specifically, they are withholding it from everyone, including themselves, because intimacy at some foundational level was made to feel like a precursor to abandonment, you do not excuse the pattern. You stop personalizing it. And in that depersonalization, something extraordinary happens. The power returns to you. Not the brittle, performative power of someone who has built walls and calls them strength, but the quiet, unshakable power of someone who no longer needs the external world to behave according to a script in order to maintain their internal equilibrium. The transcript names this precisely. You become unshakable, not because you have become cold, but because you have finally become awake. This awakening has historical precedent in every tradition that has ever taken human nature seriously. The Stoics built an entire philosophical architecture around it, the radical separation between what is within your control and what is not, and the deliberate daily practice of refusing to surrender your inner state to the chaos of external performance. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire in the known world, returned to this practice every single morning, not because he was naturally immune to the provocations of human behavior, but because he understood that clarity required maintenance, that seeing required practice, and that the rebellion against unconscious reaction was not a single dramatic moment of awakening, but a discipline, chosen, renewed, and recommitted to every single day. Nietzsche himself embodied this at enormous personal cost. He saw through the performances of his era, the comfortable religious certainties, the nationalist mythology, the polite social contracts that papered over the abyss, and named what he saw with a precision that his contemporaries found first offensive, then threatening, and ultimately undeniable. He did not do this from a position of safety. He did it from the position of someone who had decided that the cost of not seeing clearly was higher than the cost of the isolation that came from seeing truly. And that is the final, most demanding element of the rebellion. Because when you begin to see people as they actually are, when the patterns become visible, when the masks become transparent, when the emotional fingerprints left on every conversation and every silence become as legible as words on a page, you will discover something that no one warns you about. You will begin to see yourself with the same unsparing clarity. And that confrontation with your own mask, your own performance, your own carefully constructed and vigorously defended version of who you have decided it is safe to be, is not the end of the rebellion. It is where the rebellion truly begins.
There is a version of you that has never been performed. It has never been curated for an audience, never been adjusted for approval, never been softened for comfort or sharpened for effect. It has never learned to laugh at the right moment, to shrink in the right rooms, to expand strategically in the ones where expansion is rewarded. It exists beneath every role you have ever played, the strong one, the reliable one, the unbothered one, the one who has it together, the one who doesn't need anything from anyone, beneath every single layer of adapted, conditioned, socially calibrated selfhood that you have spent decades constructing with the quiet, exhausting diligence of someone who learned very early that the unedited version of themselves was somehow too much, or not enough, or simply too dangerous to risk showing in full. Nietzsche called this the will to power, and almost everyone who has ever quoted him has misunderstood it. It was never about dominance. It was never about control over others. It was about something far more terrifying and far more liberating than either. The relentless, courageous drive toward becoming fully, authentically, unapologetically yourself. Not the self that was shaped by fear, not the self that was sculpted by other people's comfort, but the self that exists when every performance has been stripped away and what remains, raw, unpolished, and irrefutably real, is finally allowed to simply be. The transcript arrives at this realization with the quiet devastation of something that has been true all along, waiting only for the right moment of stillness to be heard. It tells us that the truest version of a person is never who they perform themselves to be. It is who they become when they forget to perform. That involuntary exhale in a moment of genuine connection, that flicker of unguarded emotion before the management system kicks back in, that pause, 1 second too long, too honest, too human, before the composed answer arrives to replace the real one. These are not weaknesses. The transcript names them with a reverence that should stop you completely. These are sacred moments, the soul surfacing, briefly, through the sediment of everything it has been taught to suppress. And if you have been the kind of person who notices these moments, if you have always felt things shift in a room before anyone speaks, if you have always caught the instant when someone's carefully maintained performance develops its hairline fracture, then you are not simply observant. You have always been capable of witnessing the most profound thing one human being can witness in another: the truth. Now, here is where Nietzsche's 18 darkest truths converge into a single, blinding point of clarity, the realization that underlies all the others, the one the transcript has been building toward from its very first line. You were never hard to read, not to the people who were truly paying attention. The voice shifts, the hollow laugh, the rushed words that fill a silence because stillness feels like exposure. These were always visible. To someone, to the people who mattered, to the people who chose, for whatever reason, to see. And here is the paradox that completes the entire architecture of everything we have explored. The moment you fully accept that you have always been readable, that the performance you have maintained with such devoted, exhausting care was never as opaque as you believed, something extraordinary happens. The terror of being seen, which has quietly governed so much of your behavior for so long, begins to lose its power. Because the thing you were most afraid of, being known completely, being witnessed in your full, unedited, contradictory, beautifully imperfect humanity, turns out not to be the catastrophe you spent your life organizing yourself around avoiding. It turns out to be the only thing that was ever going to set you free.
This is what the transcript means when it says that reading people is not about judgment, it is about compassion, not the soft, decorative kind that performs sensitivity without bearing any of its actual weight, but the fierce, clear-eyed compassion that is born from genuinely understanding what it costs to be human. The compassion that looks at the man who cannot stop performing strength and sees, without flinching and without condescension, the terrified child who learned that vulnerability led to punishment. The compassion that looks at the woman who has built her entire identity around being needed and recognizes with heartbreaking accuracy the moment in her history when loving freely first became equated with loss. When you see people this way, when you stop engaging with the mask and start recognizing the pain that built it, something irreversible happens inside you. Anger loses most of its justification, not because you become passive, not because you abandon discernment or dissolve your boundaries into a kind of spiritual permissiveness that mistakes self-erasure for enlightenment, but because anger at its core is almost always a response to a story. And when you can see the story clearly, when you understand the wound behind the behavior and the fear behind the wound, the story stops being one in which you are the target. You were never the target. You were simply the nearest available surface onto which someone projected the battle they were already losing with themselves. The transcript makes this explicit with a precision that should permanently alter the way you experience conflict, rejection, and the particular corrosive species of self-doubt that comes from taking other people's dysfunction personally. What you once interpreted as rejection was self-protection. What you once experienced as cruelty was unprocessed pain finding the path of least resistance. What you once allowed to define your self-worth was never a verdict on your value. It was a symptom of someone else's unhealed history, delivered in your direction by the blind, indiscriminate mechanics of trauma, seeking release. And now, knowing this, seeing this, carrying this with the quiet certainty of something that has moved from intellectual understanding into lived, embodied truth, you are no longer at the mercy of it. This is the ultimate liberation that Nietzsche's darkest truths were always pointing toward. Not a liberation that looks like invulnerability, cold, armored, unreachable, but a liberation that looks like presence, the capacity to be fully in the room, fully in the conversation, fully in the relationship, seeing everything, understanding the mechanics of the performance unfolding in front of you, and remaining nonetheless completely yourself. Unmanipulated by the theater, undeflated by the performance of someone else's insecurity, unshaken by the reflexive rejection of someone too frightened of genuine connection to permit it. The transcript ends with a line that carries the full weight of everything Nietzsche ever tried to tell us, distilled into its simplest and most devastating form. Power is not about being unreadable. It is about being seen fully, deeply, and still being chosen. Read that again, because that single insight dismantles in 11 words the entire defensive architecture that most human beings spend their lives constructing. The pursuit of being unreadable, of being mysterious, opaque, carefully managed, strategically revealed, is not strength. It is the sophisticated adult version of the child who learned that being truly known led to being truly hurt. It is armor that has been mistaken for identity. It is the performance of power in the precise place where actual power, the power of genuine self-possession, of complete and unapologetic presence, has been quietly evacuated. The highest form of strength is not control. It is not dominance. It is not the kind of confidence that needs a room full of people to perform itself at in order to feel real. The highest form of strength is the willingness to be fully seen and to remain standing.
Because here is what Nietzsche ultimately understood, beneath all the darkness, beneath all the ruthless diagnostic precision, beneath all 18 truths about the masks we wear, and the fears we project, and the pain we perform, and the illusions we defend with our entire lives, he understood that the human being who has finally stopped hiding is not just free, they are formidable. Not because they have become impossible to read, but because they have become impossible to manipulate, because there is nothing in them that needs protecting from the truth anymore, no wound that needs managing, no performance that needs maintaining, no gap between who they are and who they present themselves to be that can be found and leveraged and used against them. They have simply become themselves, completely, without apology, without performance, without the exhausting lifelong labor of being someone the world will accept instead of someone the world must reckon with. You were never truly hidden. The people who were paying attention, they already knew. And now, finally, after everything, so do you.